Welcome back to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, and I am joined by two very special guests today to talk about a very important topic. Before I introduce the guests, though, a little background. On July 31st, 2025, the Holy See Press Office reported that during an audience granted to Cardinal Marcello Semeraro, prefect of the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints, Pope Leo XIV confirmed that the title of Doctor of the Universal Church will soon be conferred on Saint John Henry Newman. Newman, who came into full communion with the Catholic Church in 1845 after an illustrious career as an Anglican cleric and theologian at Oxford University, will become just the 38th recognized Doctor of the Universal Church. Of particular interest is that he is the first former Protestant to be granted this high honor and also the first native English speaker, not counting the Venerable Bede, who, although his name is Doctor of the English, spoke a form of English that would not be intelligible either to Newman or to any of you, our listeners. So we're going to claim him for that purpose. Anyway, to talk about all this wonderful stuff and the importance of Newman today and the importance of this title that he will soon be granted, I am joined by Bishop Stephen Lopes, who is Bishop of the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, which is a non-territorial diocese created to welcome into full communion individuals and groups from the Anglican tradition. Bishop Lopes, welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. It's great to be here.
Great to talk to you. And I'm also joined by Dr. Jennifer Newsom Martin, who is Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame. She's a scholar of all kinds of wonderful thinkers like Balthasar, Péguy, and of course, Newman, whom we will discuss today. Jenny, good to see you. How are you?
It's great to see you too. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am really excited about this conversation, not only because I am personally devoted to Newman, as I know the two of you are, and so many of our listeners are, but, you know, there's just a lot of interesting stuff attached to the person of Newman that I think this discussion of his being named a Doctor of the Church really gives us an opportunity to discuss. So why don't we jump right in? And Bishop Lopes, I'll begin with you and just kind of ask you, you know, both as a theological man and as a working bishop, you know, what is the significance of this figure, Newman, not only being canonized as a saint, but now being set apart in this very rarefied air as a Doctor of the Church?
You know, I was struck by the way that you introduced the topic because you used the formal title twice, Doctor of the Universal Church. Because I think more than other titles that we can give to saints, you know, the doctor title is characterized by its universality, because it's a declaration by the Church that this saint's theology, that this saint's reflection on the mystery of God is universally valid and universally appealing. It's not a particular culture, a particular language, or a particular time and place in the church, but that there's a perennial nature to the contribution that this saint brings forward. I remember more years ago than I care now to think about being in St. Peter's Square when St. Therese of Lisieux was declared a Doctor of the Church. You know, her theological writings, shall we say, are not voluminous. But, you know, then Pope St. John Paul II making that declaration, but nevertheless, her meditation on the little way, her intimacy with Christ in that way is something that transcends time, space, culture, and has a relevance for people of every age. That's the nature of the declaration. So while certainly in the Ordinariate we're very happy with Newman receiving this particular recognition by the Church, because you will hear it said so many times in my diocese, Newman is one of us. Nevertheless, you know, the declaration is that he's more than one of us. He's one of all of us. And so I think that universal character of this thing is really very important.
Yeah, very well said. And I want to get into kind of the Englishness and maybe even the kind of Protestant background aspect of Newman in a moment. But before we do, Jenny, you had the kind of incredible distinction of being one of the 20 theologians who actually petitioned the Vatican for the elevation of Newman to become a doctor of the church. I wonder if you could tell us what that experience was like for you and what the process is for actually getting, I mean, this is such a small group of people. This is only the 38th time in the history of the church that this has happened, and you were involved in it.
It's a real gift. I mean, it really is. It's the most wonderful, significant thing I've ever done as a professional theologian. And I just like to think that my little part, my little way contributed to such a wonderful outcome it's a real grace. But of course, I was just one part of a much larger process. So, I mean, it's very cooperative, at least in this case. The bishops of England and Wales are really the primary postulators. And so we were working with Father George Bowen, who is of the Brompton Oratory. So he was the main postulator, who was working with the bishops of England and Wales. And then, of course, stateside, our own Newman Institute for the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, they played an extraordinary role, not only in providing texts. They've done such a tremendous job of digitizing Newman's work and making it available not only to the general public and to scholars, but also to the dicastery of faith and causes. Right, so they made that available, and then they also gathered a group of scholars to. Primarily, they're the ones who organized. So Christopher Cimarelli and Ken Parker and Elizabeth Huddleston are real heroes here in this process. But several years ago, they began collecting these essays. They asked me to write a piece on Newman and the Sensus Fidelium as part of his real innovations and developments in understanding the laity and the laity's role in the church. And it was extraordinary to write and to think about the collaboration of these other scholars. We were all kind of taking a piece, not to advance, a particular reading or sort of an academic innovation or anything like that, but to represent as faithfully as possible what Newman said and indicate some lines of ongoing relevance and imminence of that doctrine. As Bishop said, this is a gift to the whole church, to the universal church. So how can we receive Newman not merely as a historical figure of very great import, but also as someone whose thought and life and sanctity is live for the whole church? And so it was really, it was a great mail day when the Positio came in the mail. It was this big red cloth-bound, lovely book with gilding, gold, and Latin in the front. And just to see your work be represented there, it was really extraordinary.
Wow. And maybe I'll throw it to you, Bishop, to follow up on this point. Presumably, Jenny, this was a process that was underway for some time. But were you surprised, Bishop Lopes, that this happened so early in the pontificate of our new pontiff? I mean, is that a coincidence, or is this a choice, like a deliberate choice that he made? It's pure speculation, I know, but something that I think listeners will be interested in.
I think it reflects a much longer process, and so. Delighted, yes. Surprised, no. I think it had reached that point of maturity. It's about, a year and a half now that the United States Bishops' Conference was asked by the bishops of England and Wales to support the petition. So formally, once the bishops of England and Wales have made their petition, they write to these other bishops' conferences in the world, I imagine all the English-speaking ones and some of the other ones, and ask them to support the petition, to make the petition their own. Our own procedure in the United States is that the first place of review of that petition would have been our Committee on Doctrine, the roughly 12 bishops who form the Doctrine Committee. I'm on that committee. So I was there right at the beginning when the committee voted unanimously to advance the question to the full body of bishops. This is, everybody thinks of the bishops' conference as some sort of bureaucratic structure, but it really is the bishops of this place expressing their theological and pastoral judgment on things. And it was a moving moment when, in that aula, what are there, 300 plus bishops, voting on this point because doctrine had already agreed. It doesn't always get to the vote of the full body of bishops, but, and to see the overwhelming nature of that vote, which doesn't always happen, I would point out. But just to say, in fact, I I was texting my classmate, who was the general secretary at that time of the bishops of England and Wales, saying, your thing's up for a vote, and just the excitement that was around that there was a deep satisfaction among the American bishops. So, I mean, it's been a process that has taken a long time. It's been a process that has involved literally hundreds of people. So therefore, to see it kind of come to this maturity is great. I'm just delighted that in this Jubilee year, it could be something that was so clearly recognized. As you say, relatively soon after his canonization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me stick with you on that point, Bishop Lopes, because Newman has been admired for a long time by a lot of people. Obviously, he was deeply admired by Pope Benedict XVI, who elevated him who canonized him. But it does seem like we're really in the midst of a moment with Newman where he means something much more maybe than he ever did. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he just means so much to me. But I mean, it seems to me that he's a really important figure now in terms of issues of evangelization, of Protestants coming over into full communion with the Catholic Church. So many different things like that. I'd love to get your take on kind of his importance as a figure in the church and society now.
I wonder if I might reframe it just a bit. Rather than talking about a Newman moment, and I agree with you, that's not to disagree, but to say, we're almost in a new Oxford movement moment. I mean, when you think about, Newman comes onto the scene and such an integral part of what became the Oxford movement. Why? Because, the ravages of the Industrial Revolution and it kind of tearing at the very fabric of society, and the upswing of just kind of this rampant secularism, dehumanization. I mean, this is Dickinson's time. And the things of faith and piety and devotion and your life with God and your friendship with God, all of a sudden seem so irrelevant with the marvel of what industry and progress can produce in God's place. And so Newman really kind of comes into that, breathing a fresh air theologically, but also in terms of piety, devotion. And then, one of the hallmarks of that Oxford movement was that this was not just a thing of the classroom or the pulpit even, but then going out into the very poorest neighborhoods in London, Birmingham, and preaching the gospel there. Even as a cardinal, Newman insisting to be, part of that fabric of inner city Birmingham and bringing the fruits of his theological reflection to the poor. Well, doesn't this time we're living in now, this moment, reflect in so many ways that very same kind of experience, except now it's not, we're not all enamored with factories and what they can produce, but, it's the technological moment. I think this is one of the reasons why Pope Leo, has spent a lot of time, already talking about AI and what that means in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of our conceptions of the human person and human dignity. The technological revolution where, babies grow up with an iPhone, and just how that completely changes their conception of the world, creates a new secularism, that arises now. And so, we're in a cultural landscape, I think, that is very similar to the cultural landscape that Newman and his friends were kind of experiencing. And so that recapturing the imagination theologically and in terms of faith and humanity, what it means to be a human being, that's where we are. And so the evangelization that's needed now, particularly, is, I think, very, very similar to the evangelization needed then. So this idea of a new Oxford movement, I think, it captures the moment.
Yeah, today's server farms are sort of the factories of Newman's day. Yeah. Yeah, very well said. Jenny, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on Newman's kind of importance as a theologian. I mean, he described himself as being committed to antiquity, and yet he found in antiquity the same Catholic Church that of the 19th century, and indeed we're in it today in the 21st century. But with that commitment, then there flowed from him a very creative kind of theology. I mean, and my sense is that theology was very influential in the 20th century, maybe in ways that we're only now really deeply appreciating, but maybe even more so coming into the 21st century. So I wonder for you, as an academic theologian, what do you think his importance is theologically speaking?
Thank you for that question. I think, one of the first things I think to say is that he models this kind of breadth of thought and style in terms of the genres in which he is able to write so effectively. So he manages to combine not only a tremendous personal sanctity and holiness and commitment to the faith in this very vibrant, very sort of fierce and luminous way, but also his clarity of thought, depending on what kind of text it is he's writing. I mean, if he's writing in a discursive mode or a forensic mode, it is without chink. It is very, very thorough and very rigorous. And then the sort of lyricism of his hymns and his poetry and his novels and his devotional writings, especially on the Virgin Mary, which I find so personally edifying. So I think, first of all, he gives us a model of what it is to be the kind of academic that transcends the kinds of models of education where you have to overly specialize and you have to only write in a certain way. And so I find him actually quite inspiring in the academic life or the intellectual life kind of as such. And I think just to echo what Bishop was saying in a different idiom, I think the moment is also ripe with thinking about a university and what a university is and does, right? And so I always go back to the wells of Newman's idea of a university and think about, what is it exactly that we're doing with these students? What do we presume to be doing in terms not only of providing them with the skills and the dispositions to be able to succeed in their careers, which is downstream from what Newman thinks and what I think as a liberal education, someone who's very committed to Catholic liberal education, but giving us this really capacious vision of the cultivation of a philosophical habit of mind, wherein we are able to see the integration of all of this truth and the integration of knowledge together, not to be, as he says, the man of one idea and sort of able to just espouse one thing, but to see things all fitting together, to see things in this synoptic, incredibly integrated, holistic understanding. And I think to me, that's exactly what the modern university needs, right? And all of these kind of moments in which the university has become siloed and has become kind of overly interested in professionalization without that kind of investment in the students' cultivation of this habit of mind and the sort of virtues of equitableness and freedom and all the things that he says in Idea of a University. I think that's a kind of basement level of what he gives liberal education, Catholic education, and the theological discourses as well. Of course, he says really lovely things about theology as the sort of integrating discipline in Idea of a University, and insists that we need to teach theology as such, right? It can't be thought of as something that's merely a species of affect or piety. Theology is knowledge, and I think he insists on that point, which I find very inspiring. But I also think in terms of the particulars, what he gives us in terms of religious epistemology, how we think about making religious decisions, how he talks in this sort of probabilistic way about, how we understand truth. I think that's really important, as well, of course, as, well, I'm sure we'll get to this later, but what he has to say about conscience and a really robust understanding of conscience as this sort of voice of God within, the sort of aboriginal vicar of Christ.
Yeah. And just to follow up for a moment, Jenny, because I think this issue of the fact that you get to teach Newman to people and you interact with people who are kind of maybe engaging with his work seriously for the first time. I mean, something that strikes me that's so wonderful about Newman is understanding his own growth, his own development, his spiritual maturity, as it were, in relation to, just the discipline of theology. I mean, his like commitment to truth, not just antiquity, but to truth, transformed him. It showed him like what he was called to be. Is that something that kind of strikes your students and people that you talk to, strongly?
Absolutely. I'm co-teaching a course this semester and last year as well called Catholicism and Tradition, in which we sort of like think about tradition as such. We, look at Congar, we think with Ratzinger, we think with Newman, of course, with Blondel, but we're also looking at particular case studies where it looks as if, how do we talk about continuity and change? These are sort of hermeneutical questions. How do we interpret this particular magisterial document in light of a development? How do we talk about the durability and the consistency and the constancy of the Catholic tradition, as well as account for historical change in these ways? And so I think when students are given, we give them a lot of the essay on the development of doctrine, and they find it utterly refreshing. First of all, just this idea of a living idea that does develop and refine, and that the fact that it does to change is because it is live, it is living, right? And so I think students really, really appreciate that aspect of Newman's thought, and they find him. I think sometimes they find his prose can be a little alienating. He's certainly a Victorian in his style, but I think once they kind of get an ear for the rhythm of Newman's speech, he articulates things that these students have kind of implicitly wondered about. Like, how do you talk about, Vatican I and Vatican II together? How do you talk about, the Galileo affair? How do you talk about usury? And with Newman's kind of marks, you get the sense of like, here's a language which can account for it in a way that does not devolve into a kind of fideism or its opposite.
Yeah.
I wonder,
Go ahead, Bishop.
I was just going to say, I think, Jennifer, it must be liberating. I think that's the word for your students, because it also takes them out of a political paradigm, which is the only thing I think they get in the media, right? Exactly. To talk about development equals change, and it's usually change of a political position. I was for this, now I'm against this, because of some sort of expediency or because the cultural mores have changed, and now to be elected, I have to be, in favor of that, whatever. Mm-hmm. And this is so not that.
Not that. Yeah, it's so principled, right?
Right. And so but I guess it strikes me that, where else do you experience that kind of liberating thought of, it's a living idea because Christ is a living person. And this is a real relationship with a living person that we have been called into. And then, of course, the more, if you will, that we can contemplate this mystery, the more we're drawn into its depths. And yeah, sure, we're going to articulate things differently and say things differently. But how radically different that is than, say, turning on the TV or looking at the social media stuff or anything else, where everything, it seems to be, to me, that we get now is just kind of prepackaged in, unhelpful, liberal, conservative, whatever kind of paradigms that are all political.
Yes, exactly. I think Newman, that's why I think he's also so helpful for this present moment, is that he transcends all of that, and he makes it look, he makes it clear just how hollow that way of divvying up the world actually is. And I think like he is a stay against cynicism, and he is all in on these ideas, but he is not going to give an inch in terms of their sort of intellectual credibility, right? So I think it is so liberating for the students, not only to have this example of Newman as this sort of great intellect, but also someone who is so generous in his thought, but also so uncompromising in his principles, right? It gives us all a model to think about. Yeah, it's not just that, development is equal to progress, which equals, the progressive or the left or anything of that. It's that's not that. It's so much more complicated, which I think we could all do with more complexity in this landscape. So.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at Newman. And, like so many of certainly the great saints, but even just sort of influencers. And I mean that in kind of, not in the social media kind of way, but in kind of a much larger sense. Like the people who really matter are the people who transcend these kinds of, these sort of binaries. That said, Newman and maybe this is, I'll throw this to you, Bishop, but, Newman as an Anglican was committed to this theory of the via media, right? And he ultimately came to believe that there was really nothing biblical or theological about that, right? That the truth is, it's true or it's not true, right? I mean, that in other words, so he came to find a kind of liberation in not trying to please everybody on all questions or whatever, but understanding that there is a truth to stand in, and it's expansive, but it's not sort of trying to be two things at once. And I'm wondering, you can take that however you like, but I wonder how that works with kind of some of the individuals and communities you work with, like people sort of trying to discern coming into the Catholic Church, or what it means to be Catholic and not Protestant, that kind of thing. How does Newman sort of, as this figure of, follow the truth wherever it leads, kind of play out in your ministry?
Yeah, I think that, for the folks who are coming into full communion, there are two, I think, orienting questions. What is true, and where is the church? Mm-hmm. And what you realize is if you kind of, stake your claim on the via media absolutely, then that second question, where is the church? Well, it never really gets answered, because it becomes whatever it needs to be for the moment, And I think, when you look at the way a number, not just Anglican Episcopalians, but a number of mainline Protestant groups are now indistinguishable one from another. I mean, what it really is the difference anymore, practically, experientially, between, Methodist, Presbyterians, we can talk about, everything historically and even doctrinally, but do those doctrines get expressed in any sort of authoritative manner anymore? And so, the truth of the faith, and if you're interested in that, and you're interested in the authority of Scripture and the early church, that then leads you to a recognition, okay, well, how is the truth of the faith conserved and presented anew, in a way that I can really kind of not only believe in some sort of subjective way, but really kind of build my life around, my family around, my, that it's the church question that comes to it. I read, a lot of the all of the autobiographical accounts of our clergy who have become Catholic from ministering in an Anglican or other Protestant environment. And I was reading all of them before I got this job, from the other end of things when I worked in Rome. And it is striking to me, because, again, of the kind of cartoonish, understanding of history with the Reformation or whatever, it's how many times, which is almost all of the times, where the person says, I have come to be convicted by the truth of sacred Scripture, and I realize that the Catholic Church is the only place where the truth of sacred Scripture is being defended. Mm-hmm. Because everywhere else it just now becomes, well, he didn't really mean that, or, well, you have to understand that kind of as culturally conditioned, or, well, the Lord meant that symbolically. Well, if we start thinking about this is my body and this is my blood in symbolic terms, we have departed from the faith once delivered to the saints. Mm-hmm. So, that truth and the ecclesial body of Christ that is the church are absolutely united. And if you're convicted by one, eventually you're led into the other. And I think that's what Newman discovered. And that is what, all of Newman's disciples now in this day and age discover.
Yeah. I mean, I remember being so bowled over reading the Apologia Pro Vita Sua for the second time, when I was sort of finally really open to leaving Anglicanism and becoming Catholic, and just being so convicted by Newman's the part about I looked in the mirror and saw a Monophysite. Right. Just the idea that it's not that he was nothing, but that there's something fuller to come to, which is, I think, something that when I talk to, fellow, former Protestants or whatever, that's definitely something that we share, and that we find, those of us who've read Newman, in Newman.
Yeah. And I would say, too, I think there was an expectation with the Ordinariates when they first came into being in 2009 that, we were there for the Anglo-Catholics, those folks within Anglicanism who already understood themselves as an expression of English Catholicism. Great, and that's true. That is not true now. I can tell you in terms of clergy and in terms of the folks that I meet in RCIA and all of the things around the Ordinariate, the biggest driver towards the Ordinariate right now are evangelical Anglicans and Christians, because it's the truth, the authority of Scripture question. And again, that commitment to the truth is like, well, yes, but here is where that truth is actually being not only conserved in some sort of, intellectual way, but lived. And so if I believe that this is true, then I have to be in the ecclesial body that proclaims that truth with authority. And so they're the evangelicals having to discover, in many cases, the sacramental life and, a liturgical expression that is more than they have experienced before. And, again, truth is personified in Jesus Christ. And so you're being drawn deeper, deeper, deeper into a real relationship. And that's all part of it.
Yeah. When I left the Episcopal Church, a lot of my high church colleagues, I think, felt sorry for me. They felt bad that I couldn't live according to kind of the high church theory anymore. It was actually my evangelical or kind of broad church friends who were sort of like, wow, great, good. Maybe I'll join you. That sounds really interesting, So it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
Jenny, let's talk about this identity of doctor of the church a little bit more. Now, some of the great doctors of the church have these kind of extra monikers attached to their names, right? Like Pope St. Leo the Great is called the Doctor of Church Unity, and Teresa of Avila is called Doctor of Prayer. And so a lot of them have these names. Some people have been wondering whether Saint John Henry Newman will get one of those, and if so, what will it be? I noticed on the internet, a couple of people suggested that he be called the Doctor of Development, because, of course, the development of doctrine is sort of one of the things he's most famous for. So I wonder, first off, what do you think about that? And second, let's talk about development a little bit, because I think that is a really, really important thing to know about Newman.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, from my impression, like that nomenclature is underdetermined at the moment. I'm sure it will be made clear. But I mean, what people have mostly been sort of batting around is, yes, Doctor of Development, Doctor of History, Doctor of Conscience. Those kinds of things are things that I've heard. I'm sure there are others. But I mean, I think anyone who knows Newman, even in a sort of notional way, knows that he is the guy. He's the development guy. And it's, of course, very tightly connected to his own conversion, right? I mean, as he's writing the essay on the development of doctrine leading up to his conversion in October of 1845, he sort of promises to himself, this is very well known, but he promises to himself that if he can finish this book and convince himself that the church of Acts and the church that he sees as expressed in the Catholic Church are one and the same, then he'll swim the Tiber. But he did never finish the book before he made that kind of like realization, right? I mean, again, he was the sort of principles and the scruples whereby you follow the truth wherever it leads, no matter the consequences. And of course, as we know, Newman's conversion was, it cost him something. It cost him friends. It cost him jobs. It cost him standing in the public eye. So it was not an easy decision, I'm sure. But this idea that, yes, that there's something about understanding this notion of development, which was very central. It was not an abstract or merely academic question for Newman, right? It's very much existential, very much, I think, wrapped up in his own call to the Catholic Church. And I think I think sometimes this is a little overlooked. Yes, the understanding of development as articulated in the essay is really important. But I also think for Newman, development is also a profoundly Marian kind of category for him. He's got that Oxford Sermon 15, where he's basically using that line from the Gospel of Luke about Mary pondering all these things in her heart as the sort of model for what development looks like. It's this kind of organic way in which you can understand a burgeoning life of an idea or of a community. And as Bishop says, I always come back, this isn't Newman, but Ratzinger, to what he says in Introduction to Christianity, when he's saying it's not just that truth is objective and that meaning is objective. It is that this truth and meaning knows me and loves me and calls me into himself, right? I mean, so it's like, that's the same kind of idea, I think, with Newman, right? So it's the notion of development is not simply theoretical, but it's also deeply personalist, and it has to do with this kind of outpouring of the graces of the truth of the living God, in Mary and in other places as well. So I mean, I think, right, the ideas that he gives us in Idea of a University, I think Newman, part of the great gift of Newman are the metaphors and the images that he can give us to think with. I mean, it's very connected, of course, to his own understanding of real and notional apprehension, right? You have to give images, you have to engage the whole person in the imagination for people to come to knowledge. And he has that image of the muddy stream, right? You sometimes think that the thing at the very beginning is clear and is finished, but he says, no, we sometimes, it takes time for the mud to clear out, so you can kind of get to this point of clear water. And I always come back to that image too, right? So yeah, I think development is certainly a contender for this title, but it's above my pay grade.
Yeah. Bishop, do you find that when people talk about Newman and the development of doctrine, that they tend to get it wrong? They caricature, what that means?
Absolutely. I mean, imagine, again, theologically, spiritually, absolutely, Newman as the doctor of development makes every perfect sense to me. And yet, as a pastor, I don't want that one. I'd much rather doctor of conscience or doctrine of communion, but because, what I dread, you can hear it now, right? So what happens? We have this beautiful celebration in Rome, whenever that's going to be. And, he's declared doctor of development. And every secular newspaper is going to lead with Pope Leo shows himself open to change, because it's such a stupid reductionist thing.
Exactly.
Because it's like, not to beat the dead horse, but, we can't go beyond those political categories. And so to develop theologically, doctrinally, there's no way. I mean, certainly the secular press, but even a lot of frankly, the religious, the Catholic journalists can't really wrap their minds around how all-encompassing that development is. And this, again, because it presumes faith.
Mm-hmm.
It presumes a real and a living relationship with God, so that your real and living faith ideas can mature and grow into a fullness that God intends. But, how far different that is from it's this, now it's that, and it will all be, it'll be, what issues does Pope Leo want to change? That claims Newman as the guide, and that kind of thing is, it's frustrating to a pastor, I would say.
Yeah.
Sorry, just if I could just provide a small kind of comment. I mean, I think that I share those sentiments exactly. And I also think that another possibility for misunderstanding is not only in this idea that this is the sort of secret, sort of progressive agenda, and Newman is the godfather of that.
Yeah.
But it's that those ways that Newman talks about the kind of 7 marks for determining, development, or like authentic development instead of an aberration. Those will get applied in a kind of like, again, another reductive sort of way, because to understand those, you need to understand this kind of like probabilistic epistemology that Newman's like, no, it's like, this is not, it's not operating like a calculus problem or a math problem, right? It's not like it's either in or it's out. You have to employ the complexity of phronesis and practical reason and assess what you see and then make a practical judgment. So that's not a kind of like mathematical reasoning. So I think we're also kind of, as a society, not very good at understanding even those processes of reasoning, which is what you actually need to understand Newman on development.
Yeah. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Jenny, but it might be helpful. Could you tell us about like one of those criteria that Newman wants to apply to this idea of development of doctrine? Just one of them, or however you'd like to take it. Because I think that's precisely, I think that people will kind of take that in the wrong direction. But I think more likely people just don't even
No.
bother with that. They just sort of say, oh, develop. That just means change, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
So could you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conservation of type. So all these kind of ideas of development, for the untrained ear, that sounds like you're just throwing everything out and starting over. But I mean, so many of these types are like, okay, so does it preserve the continuity of the typist? Does it preserve the sort of the spirit of it? So like he would say, when you're thinking about the development of these other it's like sacraments in the Catholic Church, like how can you show that this that confession is an outgrowth of baptism or any of these things? How can you kind of make those kinds of connections to the past? The sort of the other one that I think is interesting in this context is a conservative action upon the past, right? So it's not just that we are repeating the past, but there's a certain sense in which what is. I mean, of course, he uses all these organic metaphors, right? So whenever, and I'm a gardener, I think about plants and seeds all the time. But it's like, so he's got this idea of like you have a seed which is going to grow into a seedling, which is going to produce a flower, which is going to produce a fruit, which is going to produce more seeds. So you have this kind of like iterative organic image. And I think he will say we have to conserve what is in the seed, even if in its expressive forms, a seed and a tomato don't look the same. A seed and a flower don't look the same, right? But it is still like organically connected to that, to the origin, right? So I think that's really important. Those are a couple of the seven.
Yeah. I was just thinking, Bishop, about what you said about, maybe it's almost more evangelicals and people like that who are kind of drawn to the Catholic Church through the Ordinariate now. And it strikes me that there's something in Newman's idea of the development of doctrine too that's a little bit like the understanding the fulfillment of prophecy. Like I think there's one place in the essay on the development of Christian doctrine where he uses the example of how in the Old Testament we get this prophecy over Judah, the tribe of Judah, and then we never hear anything ever again about Judah until Matthew 1. And it's so I wonder if that's like appealing to evangelicals or whatever, to think in terms of like, oh yeah, all this stuff that doesn't seem that I've always been told my whole life as a Protestant is kind of aberrant to some true version of the church. Actually, it's all the fulfillment of stuff that when I really think hard and go back in my mind, I'll see that in a kind of genesis. Do you ever hear things like that?
Yes, I do. It's easier for me, because not having had my own experience of coming into full communion, I was baptized at St. Pius X parish, when I was 5 days old. I see it from the other way around, when, the group in Rome and the bishops involved and, were working with Pope Benedict XVI and putting together what would become the Ordinariates, what would become Anglicanorum Cedibus, the Apostolic Constitution that gives life to this whole thing. The idea of patrimony, the idea of, this particular expression of faith that, that when these folks come into full communion, it's that patrimony that has brought them to that point. And so it's not authentic of the church to say, okay, now leave all of that behind and become Catholic, I don't know, in a very Italian way or German way or Spanish way or something like this, right? But that can be brought in. And it was Archbishop Augustin de Noia, the Dominican, who was then the secretary at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who kind of gave it that definition of, you look at these expressions, the way of praying, the language, the way of structuring parish life, the way of bringing a covered dish like to every mass, all of those things are expressions or amplifications of the true Church of Christ. In other words, the church is looking at these and recognize these as elements that are authentically her own, but expressed in a new and a different way. So those can then be incorporated into her life in a way that resonates, in a way that amplifies the expression of faith, not changes it. So it works both ways, doesn't it? I mean, you're talking about it from the one way where the person coming into full communion has the aha moment that this is actually what I've always believed. And this is, what been in the depths of my prayer. And now it's finding new expression, perhaps, in ways that may challenge me, but nevertheless, in ways that I grow in. And on the other side of that equation is the church saying, no, you are actually expressing the faith of the church. We don't say it that way in Spanish. We don't say it that way. And nobody in Italy says vouchsafe do anything, right? But it's there, and it makes us think about these things differently, and so therefore it becomes that aha moment on the other side. This is Catholic, and the diversity of the expression does not harm the unity of faith, but actually fosters it.
Yeah. Yeah, it almost makes me feel a little heartache for Newman when I think about this, because, and also a kind of joy that his Englishness, I suppose, has a kind of full flourish now, because he did actually have to leave behind all the vouchsafes and the all of that, right?
If I may say a word, in terms of I've said at the very beginning of this, my folks, my clergy and faithful look at Newman and say he's one of us. If I were to be really honest, I don't know if it's always because of the wonderful and positive and beautiful things we have been talking about in this conversation. Mm-hmm. It's because he got treated really badly. I mean, everybody likes to talk about what he left behind and how difficult it would have been for him socially, academically, professionally, if you will, to leave Anglicanism to become a Catholic. A hero's welcome in the Catholic Church he did not receive. And one of the reasons why I think he spent a goodly long time then in Rome, he had to get out of Dodge, and then he was constantly being judged, and you can hear it. It's like, well, fine, he did this thing. Well, how many converts has he brought in? From the Catholic side, he was met with great suspicion. Mm-hmm. Because, he just didn't want to conform and, just get in line and go to communion like everybody else. Wow, that's almost exactly what a lot of my folks experience. And so, well, why do we have to have this ordinariate thing? Why can't they just join the church like everybody else does? Why do we have to have a different liturgy? Why do we have to have a different way of kind of structuring parishes? Why do we need this whole diocese thing? Isn't it just a transitory thing? I get that question all the time from a lot of my brother bishops, frankly. Isn't this just a thing to get these people into the church and then it can go away? Far different from Benedict XVI's intuition of, no, this is actually this is ecumenical fruit. This is the ecumenical vision lived, that full communion and this amplification of the ways of being Catholic have its own evangelizing effect. It has its own way of convincing others of the truth of God in Christ and in the church. But we don't experience that in a lot of ways, and so there's a real sense to which our folks look to Newman's own experience as somehow illustrating their own. And so kind of a communion there as well. So it's great that he is having this moment, as you say, Andrew, but it is not a moment I think he often lived in his own lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. In the few minutes that remain, I want to touch on Newman and Conscience, because that's another thing he's very famous for. As you said, Jenny, maybe he'll be called Doctor of Conscience. We don't know, but that's another area where I think Newman's thought can be caricatured or misconstrued or something. We'll start with you, Jenny. What does Newman mean? What is he saying when he's talking about conscience? And how does that apply kind of today?
I think, Newman is very clear, right? That, for him, he's got this very radical notion of conscience, right? As the voice of God within you, right? It's sort of both deeply within and also profoundly from without as well. It's an extraordinary way of thinking about conscience. But I know what he does not mean, what he explicitly does not mean is this reduction of conscience to taste, right? He's got in, I think it's Discourse 8 of Idea of a University, where he's he's lamenting the fact that that liberal education produces not the Catholic or the Christian, but the gentleman. And on the one hand, being a gentleman is a good thing. You have these kind of dispositions and intellectual virtues and such, but sometimes it can lead to a kind of embarrassment about the claims of revelation, right? I mean, so it's like, oh, that's unseemly. That's not proper. That you think, this fiery prophet said this or that, or a revelation, asks us to do what, or this idea that conscience is something that can deeply convict us, right? I mean, so his sense is that the conscience of the so-called gentleman is merely a matter of taste. It's like, oh, it would be such a dreadful thing if so-and-so knew that I thought or did this or that, right? I mean, so there's this kind of, it becomes reduced to a kind of like acceptability. And like, I would feel bad if someone knew this about me, right? I mean, that's entirely the wrong category for Newman. I mean, he says that conscience, as this, I think the line is, that conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, right? It's like this sort of like profoundly intimate and yet sort of stern voice, like you do this and don't do that. I mean, this is not a place for half measures. So I think that's a very radical understanding of conscience, or at least in a sort of devolved way that many of us understand conscience in the modern moment. It is a kind of a radical understanding.
Profoundly within, profoundly from without.
Yeah.
Another way of saying, profoundly subjective, profoundly objective.
Yep.
Because the other reductive way I think that most people operate, whether they say it or not, is conscience equals what I think. I think this is true. I think that is true, without ever challenging their thought, with the objective quality or the objective element of that thing. So, Pope Benedict XVI, again, in his great encyclical, First One, Deus Caritas Est, right? Spends the first third of that encyclical redeeming or reclaiming, probably better, the words eros and love, because they've been so badly used and misused and abused. I think what we're talking about, right, is we have to reclaim, in a Newman sense, conscience and development as integral to the life of the church, of the communion of the church, but radically different than this kind of cartoonish way that we approach those words, I think, in common discourse, at least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think a third, if we're making a list, is reclaiming this idea with Newman of kind of devolved understandings of the sense of the faithful, right? That if the sense of the faithful is merely, what I happen
public
to think
opinion.
At public opinion polls, that kind of thing. I mean, for Newman, it meant something very particular. It's cultivated in the regular reception of the sacraments, in line with the magisterium, like all of these kinds of things. He's using Merler's idea of this kind of like instinct for the faith, right? Mm-hmm. But that instinct is not simply a sort of knee-jerk reaction, but it is exactly as cultivated in this particular way.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from both of you is that it's so wonderful because it's rejecting the kind of Protestant private judgment, and also rejecting a kind of caricature of Catholicism, which is just a kind of robotic obedience or something. Right. It's exactly. Being your real self in the sight of God in the church, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And another example of how Newman skirts and skates between, these kind of like artificial binaries, which aren't helping anyone.
Yeah,
indeed.
Well, as we wrap up, I would just love a final word from each of you. We'll start with you, Bishop Lopes. What do you want people to know about Newman? What's great about him? Why is this a wonderful thing to celebrate?
Well, I mean, we could speak for another hour about that, but maybe a word to some of the priests and deacons who listen to this podcast or whatever. I mean, it's easy to have all the literature out there of Newman as the public intellectual, Newman the convert, Newman the great kind of refounder of Catholic intellectual and cultural life. There's a marvelous collection of essays and a book by Father Gerard Skinner, a priest of the Archdiocese of Westminster, called simply Newman the Priest, because that is an aspect of his person that I think we don't emphasize as much. And that little book kind of goes through his prayer journals, talks about one prayer in particular that he added to at several points in his life. And you have a revelation there, a presentation of an entirely different person, Newman who prayed, Newman who understood himself as a beloved son of God, and how that influenced his priesthood. So Newman the priest is something that I think perhaps this new declaration of him as a doctor will allow us to rediscover.
That's great. Same question to you, Jenny.
Yeah, I think I have a similar answer that, sometimes it's easy to get a little anxious about reading Newman. You think you've got to read grammar,
Assent,
an essay on assent, first thing. But I would say to focus in, or like that maybe our conversation hasn't focused so much on Newman's own personal holiness and sanctity and devotional writing. I think it's so important. I mean, one of my very favorite things that Newman wrote is the Litany of Loretto on Mary, when he's talking about the sort of the names of Mary. I'm thinking also about Newman as this kind of like eminently practical person, thinking of him like making design decisions at his university church, right? He's got this glorious image of Mary with these vines kind of entendrilled around her. Didn't have a lot of money, so he made the windows out of the bottoms of bottle caps. He made these very practical decisions about how to create a space of this church in Ireland, how to bring in like Irish materials and Irish marble and Irish imagery, but also to make it a place. It's a very coherent kind of space in my mind. And so, there are these ways of thinking about Newman as a heady intellectual, but he was also very practical and actually very playful. Thinking of things that he would do in at the Catholic University in Dublin, like he would do these plays that he used to do as a kid, these ancient Latin plays. He would perform them with the students. He had a kind of like a playful, lovely, playful spirit too, which I think ought not go missing as we think about Newman the intellectual.
Yeah. Well, we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to say, and I very much hope will be said by the two of you and so many other people as we continue to celebrate this great Saint John Henry Newman, 38th Doctor of the Universal Church. I've been joined today for this really edifying conversation by Bishop Stephen Lopes and Dr. Jennifer Newsom Martin. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.